Good morning again. Let's see if people can log in and see how that works. Well, today we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about the Industrial Revolution. This is actually the last time that we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. So if you have been loving all the time looking at the Industrial Revolution, it comes to an end today. Today is going to be the last day that we talk about the Industrial Revolution. Good morning, Emily. Glad to see you came back. Good morning, Noah. I'm glad to see you. And the other 6 people. Glad to see all of you. Isai, Chavez, good to see you as always. We are going to be looking at a handout called Continuity and Change in the Industrial Age. I have not done anything on our handout yet. Good morning. So I just want to, again, just remind you guys, if you have stuff you've not submitted, make sure you submit it on Teams. I've had a lot of people actually taking pictures of their work and emailing me 20 pages of pictures that I have to rotate to flip to see. Don't do that. Edit your stuff in Teams, submit it in Teams. Shelby, actually, I think the last video stopped working because it didn't know what to do with you actually watching. So I'm so glad that you're here again, but I don't know if that's going to actually negatively impact the video's working ability. So we'll see. I think the internet didn't know quite what to do. Hey, Austin, good morning. Again, just to update you, tomorrow I'm going to be interviewing, hopefully if technology works, on YouTube, my friend Peter, who's a Rwanda genocide survivor. And today at 1 o'clock, if the technology works, I'm going to be interviewing my friend Eliakim in Kenya. And we'll see if we can make a short interview happen. For both of those things, you can ask questions, I hope. And we'll see how that works. So I'm glad all of you are here today, and we're going to be looking at a handout called Continuity and Change in the Industrial Age. This is our last time talking about the Industrial Revolution today. We're moving on to new material next week. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so looks like a lot of us have rejoined, and that's good. Again, invite you guys to come see if I can work technology and see how our interviews with our friend Eliakim in Kenya, how are they dealing with pandemic in Kenya, and my friend Rwanda genocide survivor tomorrow. I'll send that information on our Remind. Make sure that you are signed up for that. Your friends are signed up for that as well. Okay, so continuity and change in the industrial world. What we're going to talk about today is what are some ways that the world changed dramatically? What are some big picture ways that the world changed dramatically? And it says on our handout that the Industrial Revolution changed 3 different things that we're going to take note of. Number one, it changed how goods were produced. It changed how goods were produced. You might remember that before the industrial era, people are making stuff primarily by hand. And if I'm making stuff by hand, things are slow to make. They're very expensive to make. The person making it has a lot of skill. And because the person who's making it has a lot of skill, I'm going to actually be paying them a good amount of money for the things that they make. There's a word for that, where someone is like a real skilled worker. They know what they're doing. They have real expertise. We call them an artisan. And that's the kind of world that we lived in before the Industrial Revolution. There was no machines making things. Things were made by hand. goods were produced by skilled workers. And so that's one way the Industrial Revolution changed the world. It changed the world in how goods were produced. Number two, there's a second way that the world changed. It changed how people earned their living. And we're going to talk about these all details a little bit further down. So the most important thing is just like the general thing, that it changed how goods were produced. Number two, changed how people earned their living. We'll talk a little bit more further down the notes how like it changed their living as far as like going from farms to factories. So we'll get all those details in a moment. And number three, it changed how businesses were structured. And that's the only thing you really need to jot down there, is that it changed how businesses were structured. For that, we'll see that there's a new thing called corporations. Capitalism brings corporations, and we're going to see how, that is a change. We never saw corporations before. That's a brand new thing. And it says, after number three, how businesses was structured, it says that a working class emerged that was dependent on factory jobs. That's a huge change that's happened. It says that a working class emerged that was dependent on factory jobs. So it changed how people earned their living. It changed how business was structured. And now in the Industrial Revolution, a working class emerges that was dependent on factory jobs. We've never seen factories before. We've never had a world where we don't need everyone, we don't need huge percentages of the population out in the country farming. And so people in a world after the Industrial Revolution, increasingly, people are leaving their farms. We still need farmers, but we don't need the high percent of people there farming, and they're now dependent on factory jobs. We also see in the Industrial Revolution that the role of women was transformed. We see that in this era of the Industrial Revolution that the role of women was transformed. In fact, one of the things you might remember, we watched a video on the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. What was true of the average person in that factory was that the average person was a woman. In fact, they made up a large percent of factory workers. And so we have women entering into the workforce in high numbers. That we before, women could work, but they would take in sewing. They would do that at home. Women could work. They would, maybe be midwives that help women give birth. Women would do jobs in their own home. They'd work at home. But now that's just not possible. We have these massive industrial machines, these factories that if you want to work, and you're going to need to work to help support your family, you're going to have to actually leave your house to do so. So we see huge percentages of women going to the workforce. The Industrial Revolution also inspired the writings of economic and political philosophers. The Industrial Revolution also helped inspire the writings of economic and political philosophers. In fact, there's two guys that you should know by name. These are two intellectuals, two philosophers that you should know. The first guy is the architect of capitalism. The first guy, he is from Scotland. The first guy, he wrote this super influential book in 1776, and he argued that government shouldn't get in the way. He argued that there is the best strategy is for governments not to have 1,000 rules and regulations. He said that there's actually an invisible hand that's going to guide things. You don't need the government to be a physical hand with 1,000 rules and regulation. That's going to make things expensive. He said what you need to do is just let people make choices, and good businesses will make good decisions and they'll survive. This man said that bad decisions will be made by bad, poorly run companies, and those poorly run companies will die. And that he argued that was the driving force of what would make success and wealth. That author, that philosopher, this architect of capitalism is Adam Smith. He's a guy that you should know by name, Adam Smith. So he's the architect of capitalism. Remember, there was like this weird French phrase, a phrase called laissez-faire, which means let it be or let it go. Laissez-faire was this idea that don't get in the way. Government just causes problems. Let the invisible hand of the market pick winners and pick losers. He wrote a super influential book in 1776 that argues for this. It's a foundational book in favor of capitalism and the free market. It's called Wealth of Nations. His most famous book was called Wealth of Nations. So we have on one hand a proponent of capitalism. On one hand, we have this man who says, you know what? Government is not part of the solution. It's often part of the problem. Let it go. Don't get in the way. This invisible hand of the market's going to pick winners. It's going to pick losers. And there's another side, another perspective. And the perspective of this author sees what is the reality like in these factories? What are the conditions of the workers like in these factories? Well, they're not good. Often workers are being overworked. They're being underpaid. There's dangerous conditions. It's not safe. It's not a good thing. And the architect of this second philosophy, which is the opposite of capitalism, is communism. And the architect of communism, a guy that you should know by name, is Karl Marx. The guy you should know by name is Karl Marx. We've talked about him. We've studied him. Karl Marx looks at the factory situation and says, this is not a situation that can be solved with reformation. It's not something that can be solved by reforming and making things better. Karl Marx looks and says, this is only something that can be solved through revolution. We need to actually have the workers of the world unite and to overthrow the evil factory owners. That he believed that there was the common people, the proletariat, and that the proletariat of Germany, of England, of the United States, of France, of all over the world, the workers of the world, he said, should unite to overthrow the evil factory owners, the bourgeoisie. Those are the evil people that we need to get rid of, the factory owners. And then, of course, we need to redistribute the wealth. Well, just like Adam Smith wrote his book called Wealth of Nations, Karl Marx wrote his book as well. His book that is the explanation of communism is called Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto. It's a really small book. And even though it's a small book, it's super influential. And communism and a related philosophy, which doesn't go as far as communism, called socialism, is actually more popular today in 2020 than any other time in American history, particularly among college-age students in the United States, particularly among young people in the United States. Communism and a related philosophy, socialism, more popular today than it's ever been. So these are some general continuities. Change. Well, we actually saw this one TED Talk about how Western Europe, how the West really led in a lot of these advances and this industrialization. And it is true, the West did lead in those ways. It says that Western Europe, and we'll throw in the United States there, that we typically include both of them when we talk about the West. Western Europe and the United States led the Industrial Revolution because it had, and there are 4 different things that we're going to talk about that they had. Number one, they had abundant natural resources like coal. Coal is going to be like the number one thing that you need to have an industrial revolution. It's a natural resource. And the thing about coal is we need it because what we're going to do with that coal is we're going to burn that coal to run these factories. We're going to burn this fossil fuel. And you might remember that there was one country that I highlighted that its natural geography lent itself to be the first country in the world to have the Industrial Revolution. This island nation not only had natural ports, this island nation not only had great rivers, this island nation also had some of the world's best deposits of coal. And that island nation where the Industrial Revolution began was Great Britain. So they were just blessed with that coal supply. It's exactly what you need if you want these factories to go. Fossil fuels from the Industrial Revolution on become super important. And as the demand for factories goes on, the fact that they have this coal is just a wonderful, wonderful blessing for the British in particular, and Europeans and Americans in general. Even today, fossil fuel is a big deal. We in the United States are producing more oil than we've ever produced before. The problem about that is earlier this week, because of the coronavirus shutdown in 2020, oil was actually trading at $0 a barrel, meaning that there's so many people staying home, so many people not driving, so many factories not running, that there was actually more oil in the market than we need. And usually oil can be up to $100 a barrel, $50 a barrel, $30 a barrel for a whole barrel of oil. And now the price of gas earlier this week was at $0 a barrel, meaning that there was just too much of it. And for the first time in history, oil was worthless this week. I think the price has rebounded a little bit, but that's like a serious challenge. And these are some of the things that we're going to see how coronavirus is impacting us in unexpected ways. Number two, second reason why the Europeans led in the Industrial Revolution, they had access and control of transoceanic trade routes. They had access and control of transoceanic trade routes. So the Industrial Revolution, there's not necessarily like a year it happens, but in general, you should know that this starts at the end of the 1700s and it goes into the 1800s. So this is about like 100-year time period. Like, you don't have to say, oh, well, it was in 17XY that the Industrial Revolution began. But you should know, in general, the Industrial Revolution is at the end of the 1700s, like after the American Revolution, and going into the 1800s. This is like this 120-year period we call the Industrial Revolution. And you might remember that in that time period, well, who controls the Atlantic Ocean? Who controls the Indian Ocean? Well, it's Europeans. Europeans, they've got guns, they have colonies, they are doing global trade. And so that's going to be really important. The 13 colonies were started before the Revolution had begun. The Spanish and Portuguese and the Dutch have colonies before there is a clear industrial revolution. So the fact that they already have the trade networks in place is going to help them to take advantage of those pre-existing empires. So it's not a new thing that the British and the French and the Dutch are going to have colonies around the world. That's going to be something that continues. Before the Industrial Revolution, they have colonies. After the Industrial Revolution, they have colonies. That they're going to depend on the colonies for money before, they're going to depend on the colonies after. But how they are using those colonies is going to change a little bit as we go. Number three, Europe and the United States had a growing population. We've actually already talked about this before as well, that because of the agricultural revolutions, you might remember we mentioned that there was all these new cheap foods from America that came to Europe, things like the potato, things like corn. That meant that people had more food to eat. People were living longer. Also, the little ice age had come to an end. You might remember that there was something called global cooling that was a problem. And we had they transitioned away from those most cold years. People were living longer. Population's booming, and that's great because a booming population, where all these people are going to find jobs. They're going to find these jobs in the factories. And so the population's booming at just the right time for these people to go into these factories. Also, three other things, or number four, the scientific revolution helped with inventions that would help in factories. Of all the places in the world, the only place where there was a scientific revolution was actually in Europe. We've actually talked about that. In China, they do a lot of important technologies, but they don't ever make any final steps into what we would call a full scientific revolution in China. For example, even though that they invent and they use gunpowder before white people do, the Chinese use gunpowder mainly for like fireworks. They use it in limited ways for military. They use it for magic. Like alchemy is like an attempt to like turn one element to another. We see the Chinese using gunpowder for that, but we don't see like the widespread use of gunpowder for like military applications like we do in Europe. You might remember there's a previous lecture we talked about that there was like a clock in, I think it was like in Istanbul in the Ottoman Empire, and they actually, like Muslim fundamentalists actually like tore down this clock. So the scientific revolution is not even something that happens everywhere. Western Europe is what, and these inventions made in the Industrial Revolution will help in factories. Letter A, this would allow for mass production. The fact that the Industrial Revolution, the scientific revolution happens in Europe means all those inventions can be applied to factories, and this factories run with these new inventions is going to allow for mass production. And that's going to be huge because, imagine you have like a cup. Before the Industrial Revolution, every cup is made by hand. It's made by a skilled artisan. They craft it. They put it in a kiln where it's like an oven. They paint it. They do all these different things to it. An artisan makes every cup. Well, now in the Industrial Revolution, we are actually mass producing cups. There's a guy, his whole job is just to paint it. There's a guy whose job is just to put it into the kiln or to take it out of the kiln or whatever the case may be. We've broken it up into small steps. And now it used to be that there was a guy who knew the entire process of making a cup or a plate or a bowl or whatever the case may be. But now you have a guy who knows one little step, and that breaking it down in steps, it does something. It makes goods, letter B, it makes goods quickly, and it makes goods cheap. It makes goods quickly and cheaply. So mass production is great because I don't have to wait forever and a half for my products. Mass production is great. I don't have to wait forever and a half for a cup or for a bowl or for a plate or for a shirt or for an outfit. Mass production is great. It makes things quickly and cheaply. There's a bummer about that, though. Letter C, the bummer is that it resulted and replaced in replacing skilled artisans. Remember that word artisan is like someone that knows what they're doing. They have a very specific skill. That's who used to make all these products. It replaces skilled artisans with low skill workers. That's who's actually working in these factories. People with very low skills. They know one particular step of the process and they get paid very little. Low skill, low paid workers. Okay, let's now talk a little bit about how industrialization around the world look. There are two countries that we've made reference to in the past that actually encourage their economies to industrialize. It says that some non-European governments heavily encourage industrialization. One country we've mentioned just kind of briefly, there's a guy named Muhammad Ali who is the leader of this country. And he once, he stressed industrialization, this Muhammad Ali. And he once said that my country is no longer in Africa, it's in Europe. And he said that as a way of just kind of expressing how much in his mind his country had changed and had been pushing industrialization. And it did to some degree. It did industrialize to some degree. That African nation that industrialized more than any other African nation was Egypt. So we'll write that as our first example of a non-European government that encouraged industrialization. But there's one country that all of you hopefully can identify. There's one Asian country that modernized, one Asian nation that industrialized more than any other. This country looked at China and saw that because China failed to industrialize, China was beat up. This Asian country looked at China and said, wow, China got humiliated in the Opium Wars. We don't want that to happen to us. China refused to modernize and industrialize. They were manipulated. They were carved up. They were humiliated by European and American forces. How can we avoid that? By embracing modernization. You might remember that there was actually a rebellion in this country where they overthrew the leadership. They overthrew the reigning power, and they did so that they could start modernizing. And that was called the Meiji Restoration. And that second country is Japan. So we have identified two non-European governments that heavily encourage industrialization, like Egypt and Japan. Egypt, we didn't talk about as much, but in lecture, we did mention them. Japan, we've stressed. And again, there is a big takeaway. You need to know, you need to remember that Japan modernized, and they modernized through something called the Meiji Restoration. I remember that. You can remember that. Meiji begins with the letter M. Modernization begins with the letter M. The Meiji Restoration was the modernization of Japan. So two examples we got there for governments that pushed modernization. Two parts of the world that led industrialization was Western Europe and the US. Western Europe and the US. These are the two parts of the world that dominate in industrial production. Together, we usually lump Western Europe and the United States together. We just call them both the West. And that's the part of the world that we are referring to whenever you hear about the West or Western culture. It's talking about Western Europe and the United States. And those are the two parts of the world that lead in industrialization. So we have a chart that kind of looks at the percent. This is the percent of total manufacturing output. In other words, if you look at all the stuff that is being made in factories or manufactured, what percent of the world is getting their products from these different countries? Let's look at the Europe first of all. In 1750, this is again where I would say after 1750 is when we see the Industrial Revolution kind of taking off. Look at 1750, Europe, they have about 23% of all the manufactured products of the world. And that's probably, in the ballpark, a representative of what you might expect based on the size of Europe. In fact, if you look 50 years later, in the year 1800, it goes up, but it doesn't really go up drastically. I mean, it goes from 23 to 28% by 1800 for Europe. But the next thing, this is like right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Look at 1860. By 1860, it goes from 28% back in 1800 to 53% in the year 1860. I mean, that's a huge increase. And if you were to look at this table, if you were to look at this chart without the context of us taking notes, and someone would ask you what accounts for this huge jump that Europe percent of all products to making 53% of the world's products, what happened in these 60 years? You should be able to identify and say the Industrial Revolution happened. 1880, they go up to 61%. 1900, they're making 62%. So it spikes, it increases tremendously, and then it kind of levels off. Europe, though, is still, even if it levels off at 62%, Europe is making 62% of the world's products. That's amazing because, other parts of the world were making those products. In fact, we'll see that in our last line. Look at the USA. Now, the United States, 13 colonies back in 1750. Look how much we're making in 1750 of all the world's products, of all the world's goods. We're making 0.1% of the world's products. I mean, compare us to Europe in 1750. I mean, man, we are insignificant to Europe in 1750. Now, just 26 years later, we're going to rebel, right? We're going to rebel in 1776. And think about like the odds. Like on one hand, we have a European power, Great Britain. Britain, part of Europe that is producing a quarter of the world's products, and the United States in the same generation of 1750, this generation of 1776, these people are producing only 0.1% of the world's products. Who would you bet is going to win that kind of conflict? People thought, well, of course, the British will. What a shocker when we, the United States, win, which is why when the British surrendered, they played the song, "The World Turned Upside Down." What a crazy world to live in. But look at what happens in the United States. We get our independence after the Revolutionary War. And look, at 1750, we're making 0.1% of the world's products. By 1800, we increase dramatically. We go from 0.1% all the way to 0.8%. Now, you may not think, oh, wow, that's like a huge change, but just like as a percent of growth, that is a lot. To go from 0.1% of the world's products to 0.8%, that's significant. But we in the United States continue to grow. Look at the next number. In 1860, we go all the way to 7.2%. 7.2% in 1860. Again, that's a huge number. I mean, this is the Industrial Revolution. Now, that number 7.2% isn't great compared to Europe at the time. Europe at the time is 53%. But we increased our manufacturing by a multitude of 7 to 9. Within that kind of multitude of multiplying our industrial capacity, we increased it by a magnitude of 9. The British, the Europeans, they doubled theirs, quite doubled theirs, but we did ours by a multiple of 9. That's super impressive. 1860 to 1880, we increase again. We go all the way to 14.7% of the world's industrial capacity. So we double again. And that's important too, because Europe in that time, they don't double. I mean, they do go up 53 to 61, but we double to 14.7. And then guess what? We grow yet again. We go from 14.7 of the world's products to the last year's 23.6% of the world's products. Europe only went up 1 percentage point in that same amount of time. We go from 14 to 23.6. So America is exponentially growing in power. We are coming literally out of nowhere. If you look at those fractions of those percentages rather, we grow the most. The United States is on its way because of the Industrial Revolution becoming a world power. What about the rest of the world? Well, when our world starts in 1750, where's stuff being made? Well, stuff's being made in China. Stuff's being made in India. Stuff's being made in the non-Western world. In fact, 73% of all the products in the world were made outside of the white world. It goes down. It goes down in 1800 to 67.7. I mean, that goes down, but it's not a dramatic decline. The dramatic decline happens in 1860. Because again, you need to know general time frames. The 1800s, particularly the mid-1800s, when the Industrial Revolution starts ramping up, the rest of the world's production of stuff goes down to 36.6%. That's a huge decline from 67 to 36.6, and it gets worse for the rest of the world. In 1880, the number goes 20.9. In 1880, the number goes down to 20.9. And in 1900, what a different world we're looking at. Only 11% of the world's products are made in the rest of the world. So who are the big winners? Well, Europe is a huge winner at first, but Europe will be surpassed by American production. The rest of the world is the biggest loser because they were the ones making stuff. China was making stuff and getting the money from it. India was making stuff and getting the money from it. The rest of the world goes from making 73% of the world's products to only 11. And we see the of the West here. In fact, if you add those two white, Europe and the United States, by 1900, we're making 85% of the world's products, something like that. And that's incredible. These are incredible numbers. Well, let's look at source of raw materials now. What doesn't change? Well, what doesn't change before and after the Industrial Revolution, the places like Asia, Latin America, that's where all the raw materials are. You might remember that. This is why Chris Columbus sails the ocean blue. He wants to get to Asia. He wants spices. He wants all those types of products. Before and after the Industrial Revolution, Latin America, Asia and Africa were important sources of raw materials. That doesn't change. You know, all the way back in 1492, Europeans were going to Asia for raw materials. All the way back before 1492, Europeans were interested in exploring the west coast of Africa, having some access to raw materials. So that doesn't change. It's been the same. Raw materials now, after the Industrial Revolution, were exported to the industrial nations. Raw materials, especially now after the Industrial Revolution, were exported to industrial nations. Raw materials could be moved quickly from the interior of a nation to a port due to something. So in other words, if I'm in India, there are, maybe there's timber, or maybe there is opium that I'm growing far in the interior of India, far in the interior of the country. And there's a new technology that's going to allow me to get maybe minerals or opium or rubber or various different things that grow in the interior of the nation and bring it to these ports. This new technology that allows that to happen is going to be rail. Raw materials can be moved quickly from the interior of a nation to a port due to rail. This is the role of trains. You know, trains are going to create this global economy. Without trains, there's no way I'm going to get opium. There's no way I'm going to get cotton. There's no way I'm going to get raw materials from these interior locations to a port and then to markets in the West. Trains make this possible. Because of this, the British build hundreds of miles of trains all around the world. They're not laying train tracks because of their love for India. It's not like, oh, we just want to bless the people of India. We want to bless the people of Africa. They're laying down these train tracks for one reason, so they can have access to the raw materials that these nations have. Number two, or the next thing it says, raw materials can now be moved quickly to the industrial world to be processed due to, and there's a second thing, now that I've got these raw materials from the interior of India, interior of Africa to the port, how do I get it quickly from a port back to Great Britain? How do I get it quickly from a port back to Europe? Well, a second invention, also supported by a steam engine, we'll write down steamships. Steamships. So rail, you have trains being fueled by coal, which is going to produce steam, is going to cause the trains to go. We have rail, and now we have steamships. The steam engine allowed for an increasingly global economy. The steam engine allowed for an increasingly global economy. With the steam engine, I think in a previous lecture, we talked about that something like half of all the grain grown in California was being sold to Great Britain. And there's no way in the world that you'd ever have an opportunity for food grown in California to have it primarily, or half of it, go to a place as far away as England. Having steam-powered ships changes everything. Now, in our world, that's not uncommon. You and I go to H-E-B, there's bananas from Central America, there's avocados from Mexico. We have a global economy. Even now in pandemic of 2020, you couldn't buy toilet paper forever. Now at H-E-B, there's Mexican brand toilet paper. There's like no American brand, but they're bringing it in from Mexico to meet the demand. This global economy begins here at this time with and because of the steam engine. The possession of these needed raw materials would make these countries a target of European colonization. The possession of these needed raw materials would make them a target of European colonization because India has these different goods, China has access to goods, Latin America has raw materials, Africa has raw materials. These are all reasons why there's going to be a second wave of European imperialism, and that's going to be our theme next week, talking about the second wave of colonization and second wave of imperialism. All right, let's talk about how ways Western Europe in particular, change. Europe originally started in the 16 and 1700s as a mercantilist system. You might remember there was something called mercantilism, and that was where a country had colonies. For one reason, colonies existed just to make their mother country money. The British would tell the American 13 colonies, you can only buy stuff from us. You can only sell stuff to us. We're the only people on the planet you can sell to. This is called mercantilism. Mercantilism said that if the Dutch knock on your door and say, we can give you a cheaper price, you cannot buy from them. Mercantilism says if the Spanish knock on your door and say, we give you a cheaper price, you cannot buy from them. So that is mercantilism. That's how it used to be in the 1600s and the first part of the 1700s. That's what it was like. Europe started as a mercantilist system where trade was tightly regulated. Trade was tightly regulated. They told you who you could sell to. They told you who you can buy from. The government tightly regulated it. Now this changes. From the 17th to the 1800s, after Adam Smith writes his book, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith says that's a terrible idea. You're going to get terrible results. Whenever the government is overtly controlled, there's no competition. If there's never any competition, there's not going to be any progress and growth. And so Europe moves to capitalism, which relies on something called the free market. They rely on capital. They move to capitalism, which relies on the free market. The free market says, let competition happen. There will be winners and there'll be losers. The losers are companies that will die. The winners are companies that adapt. Adam Smith argued that the private pursuit of profit would slowly result in general prosperity. Adam Smith that private pursuit of profit would slowly result in general prosperity. So Adam Smith said, it's good that you want to make money. Adam Smith said, it's good that you want to make a profit. Profits aren't bad. Because companies want to make a profit, they're going to find a way to get toilet paper on the shelves at H-E-B. Because companies want to make profit, they're going to find ways to start making masks for people to wear during coronavirus. Because companies want to make money, they're going to find ways to stream videos through Redbox, through Amazon Prime, through Netflix, through Disney Plus. And now you have even more choices. It used to be you had to go to a physical place called Blockbuster Video or Hollywood. Those places went out of business because I could go get a movie for $1 from Redbox. Well, that's convenient, but what if I don't want to go to H-E-B? Well, I can now stream my home through Netflix. Netflix actually used to send just DVDs in the mail. Then they started instant streaming. Amazon got in. Disney Plus got in. Now you can buy it through YouTube. All that competition makes winners and losers. Losers include Blockbuster Video. Losers include Hollywood. Losers might include Redbox. Those physical red boxes might go away. Adam Smith said, all this is good, and it slowly results in general prosperity because people might think profits are bad. It actually makes life better for you and me, he would argue. In the short term, many people suffered in factories. So until life gets better, life gets worse for many people. In the short term, many people suffered in factories. And the video that was assigned yesterday in New York, it said that people live in these terrible tenements. They live in these terrible slums. But in New York City, those slums and tenements were so terrible that the average family within 10 years, they may have started working and living in terrible conditions in tenements. Within 10 years, they're able to move out of the tenements. And so in New York City, we see transformation that, yeah, it sucked. I lived in these terrible conditions for 10 years of my life, but I was able to work my way out. Adam Smith argues that this is all temporary. Generally, we're going to be working our way up. This led to calls for social, societal revolution from intellectuals like everyone's favorite revolutionary Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a guy who said, we need revolution. Okay, so let's look at societal and changes. So we talked about economic changes. Now let's talk about societal changes. Before industrialization, most people lived and worked on farms. Before industrialization, most people lived and worked on farms. And the transforming invention of the time, the guy, James Watts is his name, and the thing that he invents that changes everything, maybe it's the most important invention ever made, is the steam engine. Without the steam engine, there's no factories, there's no train, there's no steamships. Without the steamship, no factory, no train, no steamships. James Watt's invention, the steam engine, is one of the most important inventions of all time. And, you might think about, is there something more important than the steam engine? Without the Industrial Revolution, the United States would not have become a superpower. We would not be who we are today without the steam engine. Maybe James Watt's the most important man that you don't know by name. Factories were run by steam-powered machines, and it led agricultural workers to move to industrial cities. Factories run by steam-powered machines led agricultural workers to move to industrial cities. In fact, you might remember that we were growing food better than we ever had before. I don't need all these people to stay on these farms. In fact, there's such a growth in population that people are leaving the countryside. They're coming to these factories for jobs, coming into these industrial cities. We looked at video of that yesterday in the New York video that we watched. Workers often lived in overcrowded conditions. We saw that definitely in the Lower East Side of New York and Manhattan. Overcrowded conditions. And while they're in New York and other places to fight for reforms and better conditions, workers formed labor unions. We saw this in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, that after those girls died, that women, they got together, they organized, they protested in labor unions. One of the most effective tools in a labor union is to go on strike. When you go on strike, that's when you say, look, we're not going to show up to work. And if you depend on us to run your factories, if you depend on us to get the job done, going on strike is a very effective tool. We also see during this time period that the middle class grew to include people like managers of factories. So we've never had factories before, so we could never have managers of factories if they never existed. So the middle class included to have people like managers of factories, middle class people. Before the Industrial Revolution, the wealthiest people in the world made their money from owning land. Before the Industrial Revolution, the only way that you could become wealthy, the only way that you could have money was by owning land. You were a lord, you were a baron, you were a duke, you were something like that. And the way that you got your money was through your ownership of land. After the Industrial Revolution, the wealthiest made their money from companies. After the Industrial Revolution, the wealthiest made their money from companies. So before the Industrial Revolution, the only way rich people got rich was that they owned land. After the Industrial Revolution, the only way, or the most important way that wealthy people made money was from the corporations, the companies that they had. That's why we mentioned this already. The Bill Gates, the Steve Jobs, the Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos, these people in our world, they don't earn their money because Jeff Bezos owns a bunch of farmland. Steve Jobs was not wealthy because he owned a bunch of farmland. Bill Gates, not a billionaire. Carlos Slim of Mexico, one of the wealthiest men in the world, isn't wealthy because he owns land. All these people are wealthy because of their corporations. That is a big change. Rich people were rich because they owned land before the Industrial Revolution. Rich people were rich because of their corporations after the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, women often worked on farms. That's not, shocking that your husband farms and during harvest time, you would be out there in the fields with him. Before the Industrial Revolution, women often worked on farms. but women were not paid in those settings. You're just doing what you have to do to support your family, to support your husband, to get things going. Women were not paid. After the Industrial Revolution, women often worked in factories. And there is a benefit of sorts here because women could now earn money. Now, they weren't making a lot of money, but there were instances and opportunities where women could actually start saving. There were instances and opportunities where women could now start saving. They could now earn money. And even though it is true that they were paid less than men, they were paid less than men, but because women are in the workforce, because women can now go on strike, because women can now start saving, their voice becomes harder and harder to ignore. And we'll see that they are going to actually start fighting for and earn the right to vote. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Last one on this section: during the Industrial Revolution, low wages meant the whole family had to work. And the whole family would have to work outside of the house. The whole family would have to work outside of the house. Kids are going to mines, kids are going to factories, wives are doing the same. Last section, political continuities and changes. There was a gradual expansion of voting rights. We've talked about this before. There's something called Jacksonian Democracy. From President Jackson on, regular, ordinary people are fighting for and earning the right to vote. There is the gradual expansion of voting rights. It used to be you had to own property to vote. The property requirement goes away. It used to be you have to be a white man to vote. The white man requirement goes away. Black men can vote as a result of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then the requirement to be a man goes away. So we see a general expansion of voting rights. This gave working class more say and more protection. The fact that there was voting rights increasing gives the working class more say and more protection. If I know that I need the average working class person to like me enough to vote for me, I need to start thinking about improving their work conditions. I need to think about improving how they're treated and passing some laws and some regulations. This gave working class people more say and more protection. In particular, we should note that there's a vocabulary word we should know called the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement was the movement for women's right to vote. The suffrage movement is the fight for women's right to vote. If you support women's suffrage, you support women's right to vote. There's all kinds of instances where on YouTube videos, people say, hey, I'm doing a petition. Will you sign this petition? We just want to end women's suffrage. You know, women's suffrage has been going on in our country for so long. It's really time to put an end to this dangerous, destructive pattern in our society. Will you sign this petition to end women's suffrage? And because suffrage sounds like a bad thing, people are like, oh, of course I'll sign that. You know, yes, I'm against women's suffrage too. Women's suffrage is actually the right for women to vote. And that's what a suffragist is. Suffragist is a woman fighting for the right to vote. If you saw the original Mary Poppins, the mom in Mary Poppins, she is a suffragist. She's always fighting for the rights of women. Some governments enacted social reforms so people would not rebel. You know, some governments said, you know what, we need to do something so people don't freak out and rebel. In 2020, because of coronavirus, the government says you have to stay home. You cannot go out and work unless you are what's called an essential worker. People are protesting. If you watch the news, people don't like that. They're not protesting just because they want haircuts or they want to go to the movies. They're protesting because some people are forced to stay home and cannot go to work because their jobs are deemed non-essential. Well, it's essential for them. You know, what if you are a barber? What if you are a woman who does nails? What if you are job X, Y, and Z and you can't go to work anymore? Who's going to pay your bills? And so people are upset. And to keep people from freaking out, what did the government send us? They sent us Corona checks, you know, Corona deposits our bank accounts. And for some of us, that was much needed. But at some point, that is going to go away. Who's going to take care of me this second month? So sometimes governments do stuff so you don't rebel. The government, it says, wanted to provide some progress so that people wouldn't turn to socialism. Socialism is where the government is even more in charge of things. Governments don't want to turn to socialism. And even in our own country, Donald Trump in 2020 doesn't want people voting for Bernie Sanders or for Joe Biden to turn more socialist. So we're going to give them some Corona money, some relief checks. That way we don't force people to freak out and go all the way to socialism or communism. One example of this is Germany under Otto von Bismarck offered things: unemployment pay and retirement fund. Unemployment pay and a retirement fund. Germany was a government that didn't want socialism. So they said, hey, we're going to take care of you guys. If you're out of work, we're going to pay unemployment for you. In the United States, we have today in 2020 record amounts of people unemployed. 2020 is a crazy year. In January, we had the lowest unemployment for Black and Hispanics ever recorded in American history. In 2020, we had some of the lowest unemployment nationwide. Now we have the highest unemployment in decades because of this forced shutdown. Germany says, hey, we're going to give you guys unemployment pay and also pay for your retirement. That was a new thing. Labor movements finally worked for and got four things. Number one, they got a minimum wage. A minimum wage means there's a minimum amount that the government has to pay you. I don't know what minimum wage is today, but when I started my first job in the 90s, minimum wage was $3.25 an hour. That was my first job. I got paid $3.25 an hour in the early 90s. For minimum wage, I hope and I'm sure it's gone up. They also, number two, got shorter work days. Shorter work days. You might remember that kids were being forced to work 12-hour days, and that gets limited. Number three, they also got paid sick days. Some companies to this day, now minimum wage jobs don't do this, but like my job and other jobs, you get X amount of days every year that you could take off. You still get paid, even though you don't go to work. Paid sick days. And number four, super important, is better work conditions. Better work conditions. So four different things that we see labor movements work for. Labor movements include unions and going on strike, things like that. So that brings us to a close on our time. Later in 30 minutes or so, or maybe within an hour, I'm going to have another document uploaded. We're just going to walk you through this document-based questions, reading and explaining the documents to you. Also later today at 1 o'clock live, I'm going to be interviewing Eliakim in Kenya. And I believe if the technology works, you can ask questions. It's going to be probably about 15-minute interview because I don't know how the technology and our sound is going to work, talking to someone in rural agricultural Kenya. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., we're going to be interviewing my friend Peter, who is a Rwanda genocide survivor. If you have any questions, email me. If you have late work, submit it by May 1st. Remember, for questions, you should not randomly Google search and then copy and paste and plug it in, acting like it's something that you wrote. Also, you should not ask your friend and copy word for word, including misspelled words that you may not know what those words mean. Because when I see you use words that I'm sure you don't know what that word means, that's my tip to say, I should probably Google that. Also, changing one or two words, three words in a paragraph that's been copy and pasted does not constitute your own work. These are all fun things that I've seen over the last few weeks. Hopefully you'll avoid that and realize copy and paste is not you doing work. Have a great day. I hope you guys get ready to get your Corona masks for whenever you guys go out in public. And I look forward to seeing you. Stay safe. And I'll see you guys later.